Hey, it's Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. This is a 20-minute teaser of the latest bonus episode. If you like this sample of this episode, you can hear the whole thing by becoming a paid subscriber. As you likely know, Dead Sleep is 100% independent and ad-free. I pretty much make this show myself. So your support supports my work, and hopefully my work supports you by helping you relax and listen to a good story with no loud ads, no gore, and no 911 calls. So if you like what you hear, you can subscribe via Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. There's a free month on Apple Podcasts, a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thank you again so much for listening. Good evening. This is the April bonus episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. Thank you for your generous support of this independent, ad-free show. I'm Nancy Miller, and tonight's episode is very complicated. It's a true crime saga that spans decades, centuries, with intersecting timelines, multiple identities, multiple murders, and one through line: a deadly obsession, a singular fixation on the world coming to an end. And for a 51-year-old woman named Lori Daybell, better known to many as Mommy Doomsday, this month, that's April 2025, will mark the final chapter for Lori, at least in criminal court, where she will stand trial for her role in the shooting death of her former husband, Charles Vallow. Charles was Lori's fourth husband, but he was the first victim in a series of mysterious murders that started in the summer of 2019. Now, of course, it will be up to a jury to decide if 64-year-old Charles was indeed Lori's first target of what would prove to be a kill list of people who needed to be eliminated. Shockingly, this included 2 of Lori's own children, along with the death of her romantic rival. Anyone, it seems, who stood in the way of Lori and her one true love, Chad Daybell. And in this Dead Sleep version of events, I have to distill a lot of stuff down to make it appropriate for bedtime. So if you want to know the full story of this sprawling case, I will suggest a few key sources in the show notes, including an incredible book I highly recommend called When the Moon Turns to Blood by investigative journalist Leah Satelli. Right, so Chad Daybell was Lori's eternal soulmate. Chad was a fiction writer who would one day recast his own past to make himself more powerful, all-powerful, in the eyes of the woman he loved. That's lovely Lori. And the 2 would become partners in crime in the shocking murders of the people closest to them. Of course, of the many head-shaking ironies in this case was how a love that was believed to be their destiny, a supposed love for all the ages, was that Lori and Chad had to overcome such significant obstacles to be together. That Lori and Chad's supernatural union, one that they swore was preordained, at least in the fringiest fringes of their Mormon sect. That Lori and Chad and possibly others not only colluded in the deaths of children, but also conspired to keep those deaths a secret from concerned family members and authorities for months. What's most chilling and difficult to understand is how they rationalized the murders of Lori's biological teenage daughter, Tylee, and the boy she raised as her own since he was adopted as a baby. That was 7-year-old Joshua Jackson, J.J. Vallow. As you likely know, in this high-profile story, both children went missing in the fall of 2019, which launched a months-long, high-profile search for the kids until their remains were discovered 9 months after their disappearance, in June of 2020. Buried in Chad's own backyard in rural Idaho, in the family's pet cemetery. Authorities determined that these children were likely killed in September of 2019. And all of that has been widely covered, so I won't go into much more detail than that, other than to establish a crucial timeline. Because a month later, that's October of 2019, it was Chad's wife, Tammy, who mysteriously died. Suddenly, it seemed, in her sleep, despite the fact that she was only 49 years old and did Zumba classes and was active in her community. Chad claimed his wife was in poor health. So when he woke up one morning in October of 2019 and discovered to his horror that his wife was dead, he immediately knew that this was the result of some terrible, unfortunate, middle-aged health issue that went previously undiagnosed. And his family, including his children, decided to forego an autopsy, assuming they knew that the cause of death was natural. It was sad, but it was God's plan. And it was also God's plan, it seems, for Chad to get married quickly after the death of his first wife to a mystery woman that nobody in his family had ever seen or heard of. Nonetheless, he exchanged wedding vows with Lori Vallow, who became Lori Daybell, in a ceremony on the beach in Hawaii. Not long after her funeral, however, it was Tammy's side of the family who decided Tammy's death was not part of God's plan, and subsequently arranged for Tammy's body to be exhumed and examined properly in an autopsy. The medical examiner determined that Tammy didn't die of natural causes, but died from asphyxiation. Exactly how it was done, it wasn't clear. But what was clear was that it was at the hands of her husband, Chad Daybell. And true, while nothing will bring back the lives of Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow, or Tammy Daybell, justice, at least criminally, legally, in the court system, has been served. Beginning in 2023, both Lori and Chad went to trial, and both were found guilty on all counts for their roles in those murders. For Lori, her punishment was multiple life sentences at a women's correctional facility in Idaho. Her life sentences will be served consecutively, that's one after another, ensuring that she will spend the rest of her natural life in prison. As for Chad, his punishment was most severe. After he was found guilty on all charges, he was sentenced to death in the state of Idaho. And now this month, that's April 2025, Lori faces her final judgment. Lori was recently relocated from Idaho to Arizona, where she will stand trial for her role in the murder of her former husband, Charles Vallow. And as with everything in the life of Lori Daybell, this too is murky and complicated. But here goes. Charles was gunned down in July of 2019, the result of an apparent altercation between Charles and Lori's older brother, Alex. Alex, who was in his early 50s at that time, claimed that Lori's estranged husband, Charles, by then the two were living separately, that he came over and threatened Alex, hitting him with a baseball bat. Now, Charles was an older man. He was in his early 60s, but he was big, he was strong, and he was an ex-baseball player. And Charles knew how to swing a baseball bat, which Alex said he did. at Alex's head. And in turn, Alex had no choice. He had to pull out his gun and shoot the man. Twice. In self-defense. It was a textbook case of Arizona's stand-your-ground law. At least that's what Alex believed. By the time the ambulance arrived and the police were there, Charles was already dead. As for Lori, she had no idea. She'd just come home from dropping off her 2 children at school. But when she apparently learned that Alex had shot her husband, she didn't seem all that upset about it. They were in the process of getting a divorce, after all. And Charles Vallow, Lori said, wasn't a very good man. He'd been threatening her, stalking her, menacing her. Lori assured officers with a nervous laugh and a flip of her long blonde hair that she couldn't hurt anyone. She was the victim. Arizona prosecutors tell a different version of events. Without question, it was Alex who pulled the trigger twice. But it was Lori, prosecutors say, who lured Charles in, conspiring to have him killed. And for all her talk about being fearful, prosecutors say she was more like a femme fatale, with a plan straight out of film noir. That she had Charles killed so she could collect insurance money, a sizable sum that she would use to fund a whole new life with her supernatural soulmate, Chad Daybell. But that plan didn't appear to be God's approved plan, because that was thwarted when Lori soon found out that her husband Charles had changed the name of the beneficiary from Lori to his sister Kay before he died, already suspicious that Lori had some type of nefarious plan for him. Right, so all of that was happening in June of 2019. Then, of course, the tragedies that took place in September and October of 2019. A total of 4 deaths in the span of a few months. And as the investigation into Charles Vallow's death continued, there was one last tragic twist at the end of 2019. The shocking death of Alex. That's Lori's brother, who actually did die of natural causes, some type of mystery blood clot, and he was found in the bathroom of an apartment, dead. So in this whole case, in the murder of Charles Vallow, anyone who might have been there, her children, the shooter, is dead. So now here we are. As of April 7th, 2025, it's Lori Daybell's last stand. As she stands alone in an Arizona court, Lori will be representing herself in court, which means, if nothing else, this trial will be a spectacle, and one that reflects Lori's convoluted belief system that the world, at least this world, is against her. And it will be exhausting and maddening trying to comprehend how Lori Daybell doesn't appear to feel remorse or any type of regret about what happened, not with her children, and likely not with her 4th husband, Charles. Now, it will be up to a jury to decide whether Lori is innocent or guilty. But for anyone who will be observing this trial, if her behavior in this courtroom is anything like we've seen in previous courtrooms, another wild example of Mormons run amok, the likes of which we've seen since John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, and the more recent true crime scandal of another Mormon mommy turned monster, Ruby Franke, and her sinister Svengali, Jodi Hildebrandt. But to dismiss Lori Daybell as some type of crazy Mormon, a religious zealot, some type of psychopath, I feel is a mistake. Because the more you look into the details of Lori's life and Chad's life and the whole culture that we'll call Big Doomsday, the more you will realize she's just one part of a whole apparatus, one that has made the end of the world something that people prepare and look forward to with a troubling amount of zeal. And Big Doomsday isn't fueled by God or by faith. It runs on fear, along with the deepest, most human desire there is. A desire for fame, for power, and for glory. A vision of glory that only people like Lori can see. Because it turns out, the story of Lori Daybell doesn't start with end times. Her story begins with promises made in the promised land of Southern California, 1965. When Lori's parents got married. Lori's mother, Janice Connor, was just 18 when she married Lori's father, 24-year-old Barry Cox. The couple set up house in a nascent suburban enclave in the county of San Bernardino, California. San Bernardino County is located about an hour's drive outside of Los Angeles. And in the mid-20th century, developers worked very hard to graft Los Angeles' Mediterranean aesthetic onto the dusty, desert-like plots of land around San Bernardino. And with the help of some aggressive real estate agents and scrupulous landscaping, the area was indeed a successful facsimile of paradise, with bougainvillea, backyard swimming pools, and golf courses with neon green turf. It was a place where family and faith were everything, thanks to a strong LDS community, that's shorthand for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Janice and Barry were the newest generation in a century-long Mormon migration, a colonization of California that began in the 1850s and continued off and on for decades. Even now, in modern times, California has the second highest amount of members of the LDS community outside of Utah. Janice and Barry were just one ranch house, one parcel in the vast American dream. And back in 1965, if Janice and Barry ever shared news of their wedding in the local newspapers, very few would have remembered it, because the front pages of all local and many national papers was the tragic story, a scandal of another couple. Only their dream of perfect paradise went up in a ball of deadly flames. A murder case that was immortalized by the iconic journalist Joan Didion, who covered the trial back in the 1960s. In the spring of 1965, a 34-year-old wife and mother of three named Lucille Miller was on trial in a capital murder case. Lucille was accused of killing her husband, Gordon Miller, and staging the whole thing as a terrible car accident. Like Janice and Barry, Lucille and Gordon, whose nickname was Cork, they also married young. Lucille was 18 and Cork was 24. And when young, pretty Lucille agreed to marry the young and handsome and soon-to-be successful Cork, she did so with certain expectations, promises that were made. That Lucille's life would be the best, better than any generation of women who came before her. Lucille wasn't Mormon, but she was religious, a Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh-day Adventists were another Christian denomination that evolved around the same time as Mormonism, back in the early to mid-1800s, in an era known as the Second Great Awakening. It was a wild era where it seemed every Tom, Dick, or Joseph Smith forged a new style of Christianity. This second awakening offered ordinary people a closer connection to faith and community building, with like-minded people coming together to address social issues that most mattered to them. Latter-day Saints and Seventh-day Adventists aren't the same, but they do share a key belief in common. It's right there in their names: Latter-day and Seventh-day. Both of those religions believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ. But their visions of what second coming will look like are starkly different. Simply put, for Adventists, the return of Jesus, it's like a party where everybody's welcome. But if it's Mormons who are throwing the End of World Fest, only 144,000 people will be invited. Special VIPs who will be working the door to let you know if you're in or out. And if you're in, you're saved. And if you're out, you are welcome to burn in hell. Of course, that's my description. That's not in the scripture. But back in 1965, it was Lucille Miller who decided her husband should burn. Because after 15 years of marriage and 3 children, it dawned on Lucille that life wasn't going to get any better. Not with him. Lucille's husband was a dentist who really wanted to be a medical doctor. He was a man who couldn't bear the sight of having to look into the gaping void of another person's open mouth. Lucille spoke of how she'd saved Cork many times from his own depression and the possibility of ending his own life. This was back in the 1960s, back when people took uppers and downers like vitamins. And despite the Adventist religious ethos of clean living, Cork took barbiturates. The ones he'd apparently had too many of. The ones that had let him fall asleep nearly into an apparent coma in the couple's Volkswagen Bug. And that's when a ride to the store for milk ended in a fiery blaze. One that Lucille managed to escape from, but Cork did not. That's what Lucille swore. Lucille was innocent, and it was all an accident. Right away, the police were suspicious, because there were the little clues, fire patterns and tire tread marks that didn't add up. Then there was the big tip-off, that Lucille was having an affair with another man, a married father whose daughter was friends with one of Lucille's 3 children. And then, of course, there was the other suspicious death. The man with whom Lucille was having an affair, his wife, unexpectedly died. Now, this was before the death of her husband. But what was suspicious was Lucille was the last one to be with her the night that she died. And the circumstances around her death were a complete freak accident, like nothing anyone had ever heard of before. Because Lucille and her friend were unique in this Adventist community. Most women didn't wear makeup and kept their clothing plain. Lucille and her friend were glamorous, fashionable, and enjoyed having their hair and makeup done at all times. The style back then were giant bouffant and beehive hairdos, piled high to heaven and teased to kingdom come. And it seems that night it was Lucille's friend who had a deadly reaction to a bottle of hairspray. Now, this death was ruled an accident, but suspicions about Lucille hovered over her like a cloud of noxious aquanet. Lucille's case was shocking. It was Doris Day meets double indemnity. A lovely, kindly, attractive housewife who'd made her husband's death doubly gruesome to collect double the insurance money. And in the end, her husband's death didn't yield Lucille's greatest desires. The man she had the affair with would deny their love ever existed. It was just a fling. Though he would find true love soon enough. He ended up marrying his children's young European nanny. Lucille was ultimately found guilty of murder, but spared the death penalty, in part because Lucille discovered she was pregnant early on in the trial, which might have elicited some compassion where there was otherwise little sympathy for the unapologetically outspoken and glamorous philanderess. Lucille Miller was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She served a total of 7 years and was released in 1972. And as she worked to put the pieces of her life back together, just a town or two away, Janice Cox and her husband Barry were ready to welcome their 5th child into the warm California sunshine. Janice and Barry were anxious about this baby because they'd tragically lost their 4th child, another girl, when she was barely a newborn. When the new baby was born, they named her Lori. Lori is a name that means victory, triumph. And Lori Cox, it seemed, was born a winner. She'd won the genetic lottery for starters, at least in the eyes of her community. Between the Mormon ideal and the 1970s and 80s worship of Farrah Fawcett, Christy Brinkley, the blonde hair and blue-eyed Lori was the perfect California girl. By the time she was in high school, Lori was a popular cheerleader who could get any boy she wanted. And yet she was still known for being quiet, kind, and religious. She studied scripture every morning before she went to school. But her perfectly pulled-together looks on the outside belied the chaos happening behind the closed doors of the Cox family home. A home life that was always in chaos, with few boundaries, beyond the rules imposed on Lori as the second youngest daughter in the family. Barry, Lori's father, who made a good living selling insurance in the LDS community, was vehemently anti-government. He refused to pay taxes, and for years he and his wife battled the government over hundreds of thousands of dollars owed in unpaid taxes. A never-ending battle that would become such a distraction. It distracted Barry and his wife Janice from the important health and welfare of their own family. Back in 2019 and 2020, when it was clear that something had happened to Tylee and JJ, and they were definitely missing, Barry and Janice didn't appear to do anything publicly to show the support for their own missing grandkids. And at the same time, when those children were missing, and Lori was behaving strangely, it appeared, at least publicly, her parents were more caught up in this whole tax thing, busy fighting that injustice. But Lori picked up a few things from her father. Barry described anyone who paid taxes, citizens who followed the status quo. They were all zombies. Zombie, that's a word Lori would come to rely on years later. When she and Chad were deciding for themselves and for the fate of the world, who was a zombie and who wasn't, who deserved to live and who needed to die.